we can begin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this fine afternoon. We gathered here today following a number of unfortunate events which occurred recently. We all heard about the school board in Tennessee, which banned Art Spiegelman's graphic novel, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Mouse. And this is after October of last year, in which a different school district in the great state of Texas advised the teachers to balance Holocaust books with quote unquote opposing views. Only a few days ago, a Jewish mayoral candidate in Louisville, Kentucky was shot at. And you can turn to today's edition of the New York Times op-eds and read about the experience of Charlie Citron Walker, the rabbi who was held hostage for 10 hours in Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas. But what really shook the stratosphere, the Twitter sphere, is Whoopi Goldberg comments on The View. The celebrated actress and now TV personality discussed the canceling of Mouse and said, live on ABC, that the Holocaust was not about race. Instead, she explained it was white-on-white violence. It was that, and I quote, she said the Nazis were white people, and most people they were attacking were white people. And Goldberg was immediately accused of misunderstanding and minimizing the Holocaust and was suspended from the show for 2 weeks. So, of course, the thing is, Whoopi Goldberg expressed what most Americans, and I assume even many American Jews, believe in. The discourse in the US positioned race to be about, and mostly about, if not only about, skin color. Goldberg is not an anti-Semite. If anything, she's misinformed. And Jewish identity indeed is a complex subject, right? So what do we talk about when we talk about Jews? Are Jews a people? Some say religion, other will say a nationality or a culture. Of course, we have the million-dollar question of today: is race a part of the equation when it comes to Jews? So we'll try to tackle some of these topics on today's panel. We have 3 faculty members from the Center for Jewish Studies here at the University of Florida. Norman GODA is here. He's the director of the center, and the Norman and Irma Braman Professor of Holocaust Studies. Rachel Gordon is here. She's a Samuel Shorstein Professor at the center and the Department of Religion. Professor Gordon researches Judaism and Jewish cultures from the early 20th century to the present. And last but not least is Professor Jack KUGELMASS, Melton Legislative Professor and a cultural anthropologist who focuses on the anthropology of Jewish life, especially in Poland and the United States. My name is Roy Holler. I am an assistant professor of Israel studies at the center. We will hear a short commentary from each of our panelists and then move on to a Q&A session. You will be able to post questions and comments for the members of the panel in the Q&A box below. You can do it as you listen to the speakers or during the conversation, which will begin shortly after. So without further ado, I will now turn the Zoom box over to Professor Gordon. Professor Gordon, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Roy. And like you, I agree that the Whoopi Goldberg comments were important because it's not just what Whoopi Goldberg thinks, but I think they're really revealing of how actually probably a lot of people think today about Jews and the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. The title of our event, Are Jews a Race, is a complicated one to answer, in part because the way Jews have thought about this has changed over time. So even in the late 19th century, early 20th century, American Jews talked proudly about being members of the Semitic or Hebrew race. The Jewish philanthropist Jacob Schiff gives money to create the Semitic Museum at Harvard University because he is proud of what his race, then often called the Semitic race, has contributed to civilization. And it wasn't until 2020 that Harvard actually changed the name of that museum so that it's no longer called the Semitic Museum. And that affinity for racial discourse to think about or describe Jewishness starts to recede a bit with the rise of eugenics in the 19 teens and 20s and 30s. And I think sometimes today we think of, the eugenics in the US as sort of fringe because it's been so debunked. But at the time, it was really mainstream, cutting edge science that was embraced by all of these higher institutions of learning. Stanford, University of Virginia, Johns Hopkins, Harvard, especially, really embraced eugenics in part because it really matched the Boston Brahmins' view of themselves as being of superior stock. Let's preserve our bloodlines, was their thinking. And the other thing about eugenics is it becomes really useful to the anti-immigration activists. So they've been, trying to get anti-immigration passed since the beginning of the 20th century. And finally, as we know, it succeeds with the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which is the most restrictive immigration law. And it ends up really making it hard for Jews from Eastern Europe, for Southern Italians, and it excludes Asians. So during the first half of the 20th century, we're gaining some insight about how relevant race and racism really is to Jews and the topic of anti-Semitism, so that when people today try to say, oh, anti-Semitism isn't really about racism, well, we think back to these eugenic days, and it was because of this racist thinking that fueled eugenics that caused this anti-immigration, that more Jews from Europe weren't able to escape Nazi Europe in the 1920s. And then, as we also know, Hitler is learning a lot of lessons from America's eugenics thinking. He is a big fan of a book written by a New York aristocrat, Madison Grant, published as the Passing of the Great Race in 1916. I think the Library of Congress has Hitler's copy of that book. Hitler was said to have written a piece of fan mail to Hitler and refer to Grant's book as his Bible. So we know the Holocaust was also inspired by this kind of racist anti-Semitism. But what we also have going on in the American context is the work of anthropologists under the German Jewish anthropologist Franz Boas at Columbia, and actually a few women anthropologists working under him, Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, start to do the work in the 1930s and 1940s of shifting the conversation away from race. And eventually, Hitler is going to really delegitimize this racial way of talking about Jews. I just wanted to share my screen to show you what was the most popular pamphlet that Ruth Benedict and another woman anthropologist, Jean Weltfish, published in 1943. This is a really popular pamphlet that was meant to teach Americans how to think about race in America. And if we jump over to, I think it's page 11, they talk about Jews. Let me just jump one more page. So Aryans, Jews, Italians are not races. Aryans are people who speak Indo-European, Aryan languages. Hitler uses the term in many ways, sometimes for blonde Europeans, including the Scandinavians. As Hitler uses it, the term Aryan has no meaning, racial, linguistic, or otherwise. Jews are people who acknowledge the Jewish religion. They are of all races, even, and here she uses the N-word, Negro and Mongolian. And so this is what was interesting for me, because I'm researching Gentleman's Agreement and its author, Laura Z. Hobson. I found this pamphlet in her archive, and she actually uses it in her best-selling novel, Gentleman's Agreement. She has her characters look at this pamphlet. This is part of this work that's going on in the 40s to shift the discourse around Jews away from race. So our 1940s moment is another important moment on our timeline of a changing conversation about Jews away from race. And we're in another one of those important moments right now, with a sort of racial reckoning going on I think we're again, trying to understand how to talk about Jews and whether race is a relevant category. I would say it is, mostly because, most Jews, although most Jews are white presenting, because of our ethnic particularity, we don't think of ourselves as white in the same way as Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And then also, to be honest, with the rise of a white nationalism that really sees Jews as an enemy in a racial war, then, race becomes relevant again. It's also, of course, interesting to take note of the fact that Jews have always benefited from appearing white, so that has to be factored in too. While the racial binary that has mattered in Europe was Aryan and Jew, in the US, it was Black and white. And so, yes, Jews have been privileged by the ability to be in that white camp. And yet, as we were also saying, their whiteness is complicated, and there's no denying that racism has been a part of the history of anti-Semitism. So that might be good for right now.
Thank you, Professor Gordon. That was very interesting. I will turn the microphone to Professor KUGELMASS, who's joining us straight from Turkey this afternoon. Professor KUGELMASS.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I will try to. I'm responding to the Whoopi Goldberg brouhaha and how that relates to this discussion we're having, that it prompted really for discussion on race and American Jews. And I put down a number of different thoughts. So, it's sort of food for thought for myself and perhaps for you, and we'll see where this goes. I have to say, first, I'm not particularly disturbed by Whoopi's comments. I mean, she's a media personality. She's not an intellectual. She tends to be provocative, so it's not surprising that she would misspeak or even misthink when attempting to be the latter. I doubt there was any animus intended, and I think she is known to be rather friendly to Jews rather than the opposite. And I suspect any unwillingness to accept her apology shows how much we live in an age of so-called cancel culture. And here's an opportunity to sort of to get back, at someone for misusing a kind of term. I'm sort of reminded a little bit of Larry David, that he got it right. It's really sort of spite culture is what's going on. So this refusal to accept the apology is an example of spite. So as I said, her track record doesn't really merit sort of refusal to accept the apology, no matter how stupid her comment, and even a stupider apology might be. But her faux pas does tell us something rather surprising, namely that despite the onslaught of Holocaust films, novels, exhibitions, museums, and news or human interest stories, and academic books, ignorance about the Holocaust is shockingly obvious. In other words, if someone as intelligent and sensitive as Whoopi has such limited understanding of how racial thinking was very much at the heart of the Holocaust, what do most people think? And I think that in this, my colleagues got it right. So the fact that the brouhaha revolves around Whoopi Goldberg is particularly interesting because it tells us something about race in the US, and especially about relations between Jews and African Americans. So I'd like to suggest the following. Perhaps the brouhaha has something to do with her presumed attempt at passing as a Jew. Look at her adopted surname. And there's reasons why she adopted that surname. At one level, this has a tone to it of betrayal and of a particularly vile kind, breaking the 11th or the 614th commandment, which has become the primary commandment of American Judaism. Thou shalt not take the Holocaust in vain, or the word Holocaust, whatever the official term for it is. She seemed to do precisely that, and worse, she did it as a sort of Jew, as a quasi-Jew. It also has something to do with the positive valence of race in contemporary American and the cultural capital, contemporary America, and the cultural capital being or having been an oppressed minority. It also speaks to the terror of erasure, of not counting as another, in this case, of not being dark enough. And that only one aspect of difference counts, namely skin color. And this is certainly her faux pas, since racial or physiological difference includes many attributes besides color. Indeed, even cultural beliefs and practices, as well as talents, may be and have been considered as signs of racial difference. An anecdote to illustrate this: in the 1930s, when Jews dominated basketball, pundits speculated about the racial reasons for this dominance. Jews had a unique sense of vertigo. Jews were innately cunning, so they could dribble the ball down the court. Getting back to the anger over Whoopi's statement, the Holocaust is a crime of white people against white people, and she's not entirely wrong on this. Apparently, it doesn't have the same value in the post-colonial zeitgeist as it would if it were a crime by white people against a racial minority. It sounds odd, but those of us who work in academia have become somewhat familiar with this line of reasoning. I suspect that what Whoopi was driving at was how to dismantle the enormous unequal value of the Holocaust in a world of limited good, that one person's gain is another's loss. In other words, how can Black people and others who have suffered racial injustices have their wounds addressed if they seem to pale in comparison with the murder of European Jewry, or at least in terms of the volume, not to mention power of Holocaust-related cultural production. There is no Black Mouse or Schindler's List. Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner never achieved the same acclaim as did Sophie's Choice, or the periodic tables, or Diary of Anne Frank. Perhaps this was the solution. Or perhaps she was simply saying that Black people did not perpetrate the Holocaust. It's white people who did, and it's white people who need to reflect on its meaning. For Black people, coming to terms with slavery and segregation are burdens enough. And if she's saying that, it's food for thought. I mean, she's entering the fray, entering the fracas, and I don't think what she's saying is so terrible. What Whoopi ignored is that historically Jews have been positioned ambiguously between whites and people of color, a categorization that has fluctuated over time and place and is somewhat intersected by class and certainly by what the French sociologist calls habitus, or that we might in a sense refer to as culture in an anthropological sense. In other words, there are any number of upper-class Jews, even if the gates of entry to the patrician class are often rather narrowly open for Jews for reasons of religion, patrimony, or place of schooling. Not only has race been used by non-Jews to designate Jewish difference, but Jews often rely on race to guarantee Jewish difference, especially in the face of significant Jewish social mobility, assimilation, and intermarriage. Jews believe in race the same as non-Jews believe in race, even though there's no such thing as race. Anthropologists have long argued that race as a category has very limited biological merit to it, and absolutely no connection to language or culture. Yet people continue to rely on race as a way of parsing the world into types, and it is used both offensively and defensively. The more they really aren't so, the more Jews want to reassure themselves that they are, indeed, still different from them. American Jews have come to rely on Black people to highlight their own difference. This twinning of Black and Jews underpins the significance of Leon in the HBO series Curb Your Enthusiasm. The twinning doesn't mean sameness, but rather being on the spectrum. Take, for example, Mel Brooks' line in the cult classic Blazing Saddles, when the Yiddish-speaking Indian chief announces to his band, after spotting a family of Black people in a covered wagon, he screams out, "Schwarzes, hast du mal gesehen Zazach?" Black people. Have you ever seen such a thing in your life? They're Mel Brooks acting, they're darker than us. It's a very, very important statement, in my opinion. Interestingly, a century ago, some German Jews suggested a more labile category for Jewish difference, tribe. Unlike the race, tribe is a social and cultural unit whose members may or may not be genetically related, while others can choose to affiliate with the tribe. And tribal members can disaffiliate and affiliate with other tribes. Not so members of a racial category, in which identity is fixed at birth and is not a matter of choice. Of course, in the American context, skin color has long had special meaning, but so has Jewishness. Getting back to the question of erasure, which I believe underlies the response to Whoopi's faux pas, take the narratively weak but musically beautiful recent film Respect, based on the life of Aretha Franklin. Jerry Wexler was a producer who helped to propel Franklin to stardom. Structurally, he mediates a white-black binary. Indeed, he is credited for having renamed race music rhythm and blues. Not portrayed in the film as particularly Jewish, except in regard to face and body comportment, and perhaps his self-declared atheism. Yet the reality of Wexler is somewhat the opposite. He was very much a New York Jew and was buried in a Jewish cemetery with a matzeva, with no shortage of Jewish iconography and Hebrew inscription. The only sense of his Jewishness in the film is that he looks Jewish. The real Wexler, not so much in regard to facial profile, but especially in regard to body language and speech style, two primary characteristics of Jewish difference after swarthiness, curly hair, large noses, and loquaciousness. The latter, I think, betrays us all in this room, more so than our Moses and even our noses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor KUGELMASS, and our latest respondent on this panel before we move to Q&A. And I do see some interesting questions already pop up on the board, and I encourage you to give us some more. Professor Norman GODA, you'll give us a historical review. Professor?
Thanks, Roy. I'm a little less forgiving to Whoopi, and I'm not sure how people will feel about that, but here goes. In his novel Endymion, written in 1880, Benjamin Disraeli, a converted Jewish prime minister of Britain, has a character named Baron Sergius who proclaims, and I quote, "No man will treat with indifference the principle of race. It is the key of history," unquote. The character then enumerates racial differences between the peoples of Europe. The Jews, he says, are not Europeans, but Semites from the Middle East. He continues, "There is no race gifted with so much tenacity and such skill and organization. These qualities have given them an unprecedented hold over property and illimitable credit," unquote. After predicting the Jewish takeover of public affairs, Baron Sergius says, and I quote again, "Language and religion do not make a race. There is only one thing that makes a race, and that is blood." Disraeli's character reflects prevailing ideas of the late 19th and early 20th century concerning race and race as it related to Jews. And we can note a few things. One, the discourse reflects an age in which the seemingly empirical classification of everything from plants to animals to human beings made sense. Two, the classification of humans was an intellectual construct that placed blood over culture in divining supposedly biological traits. Three, as race was a construction, it could also be turned against a group, in this case, the Jews, because the very racial traits that led to Jewish success after emancipation in London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and elsewhere could be seen as harmful to everyone else. This was a component of modern anti-Semitism, which argued that the base materialism, rather than more spiritual idealism, was at the heart of Jewish racial identity. Jews couldn't act otherwise. Worse, as a foreign race, it was not really European. Jewish loyalty was not to Germany or France or anywhere else, but to other Jews, to the point where by the 20th century, conspiracy theories of Jewish global takeover were in the air. This mix of racism and conspiracy theory became more prevalent after World War I. I don't need to tell anybody here how powerful this brew was. It was swallowed by the Nazis and their allies in segregating and then killing Europe's Jews as a way to make the world anew. And we know too that this racial construction mixed with conspiracy theory is still with us, from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh, to barely reported school board meetings, such as one in Arizona just last November, where an angry parent noted, and I will quote her, "These things, the deep state, the cabal, the elite, you can't mention it, but I will. One race owns all the pharmaceutical companies. These vaccines aren't safe and they aren't free. You're paying for it through the increase in gas prices and food prices. And if you want to bring race into this, it's the Jews," unquote. Well, we all know about that. So what about Whoopi Goldberg, who argued that Jews, as white Europeans, were not a distinct race during the Holocaust? I agree with Jack. The offending part here did not have to do with Jews and race as it related to Nazism. This was a historical error, which many pointed out by citing the Nazi obsession with race. The disturbing part lay in what was inferred, that the Holocaust as a white-on-white crime could be homogenized into normal political violence. Not being about race, the Holocaust was, she said, simply about man's inhumanity to man. Leaving aside the meaninglessness of a phrase which could just as easily be applied to a mixed martial arts competition. The offense here was to minimize the Holocaust by looking at it through a no less arbitrary racial lens. European racists insisted that there was a distinction among Jews determined by blood that was existentially dangerous. Goldberg lumps Jews in with the Europeans who killed them in this sense. I agree with Jack too that Goldberg is a celebrity and surely not a thinker, but perhaps unconsciously, she borrows from a long strain of post-war, post-colonial thought. In 1950, the great Caribbean poet Aimé Césaire wrote a powerful manifesto on European colonial oppression titled Discourse on Colonialism. It is part of the canon of post-colonial literature today. Most of it concerned colonialism, which Césaire saw rightly as a European crime based on race. Césaire in the book also confronted Hitler less as a man obsessed with the Jews than as a metaphor for European colonialism. Hitler, he said, was every European colonialist. And what Europe could not forgive in him, Césaire said, was, quote, the crimes against the white man, the fact that he applied to Europe colonial procedures, which until then had been reserved for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa, quote. Thus, the Nazi reordering of Europe was nothing new. It was the old wine of white on black colonial crime poured into a new bottle and applied to other Europeans. Now, Césaire is so iconic that few would point out that he simply misunderstood Hitler, misunderstood German war aims, misunderstood anti-Semitism, and misunderstood the Holocaust. For while Nazi anti-Semitism was based on race in part, it was also based on an existential threat not to be dominated and exploited, but eradicated from the planet. The final solution to the Jewish question was racial violence in the eyes of the Nazis against an enemy whose whiteness was, shall we say, only skin deep. Césaire wasn't the only one to get it wrong. Robert Jackson, the Supreme Court justice who served as chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, also misunderstood the centrality of anti-Semitism to Nazi thinking, believing it to be an ancillary aspect of Nazism's will to conquer. Yet Césaire's misunderstanding is unfortunate in an age which is once again focused on race and indeed racial oppression as an explanatory motor of world history. Why? Because just as the Nazis imputed a racial identity to the Jews in such a way as to render them dangerous, much of the discourse today also imputes a racial identity to the Jews. Jews are portrayed as white, but more importantly, they are portrayed as carrying something called whiteness. The academic trend of intersectionality is an intellectual theory that uses analysis of race and gender as a means by which to understand and thus unmask systematic oppression. The sociologist Karen Stogner at the University of Passau notes, however, that intersectional theory does not have a place for the study of anti-Semitism because racism in Black and white is the sole lens through which to understand human relationships. Jews, so the argument goes, are white, but whiteness is the real problem, for it carries with it privilege, which includes money, power, influence, and dominance. Intersectionality thus not only overlooks anti-Semitism, it tends to confirm anti-Semitic stereotypes of ill-gotten power, oppression, and behind-the-scenes manipulation. Jews are the personification in this view of uber whiteness. And if one takes a hard left turn, One can hear that Zionism is not a 19th century doctrine of peoplehood, but a racist imperialist dogma shot through with whiteness. In fact, this too goes back to the immediate post-war years. When addressing an Anglo-American panel on the future of Palestine in 1946, the much anticipated Arab leader Jamal al-Husseini said that Jews were not a distinct race with any claim to Palestine, but rather run-of-the-mill European imperialists. Listening to the Jewish leader David Ben-Gurion, Husseini insisted, was comparable to, quote, hearing Hitler from beyond the grave, unquote. Knowing that overt anti-Semitism had been discredited by the Nazis, Husseini deployed the simpler charge of Nazi racism against Jewish leaders, thus dodging anti-Semitism, imputing whiteness to Jewish refugees, and turning racism on its head. But was whiteness itself ever really the issue? In May 1946, Syrian President Shukri al-Quwatli forgot the careful linkage of Jews with whiteness and racism, and in an unguarded moment, when speaking frankly with a trusted US diplomat, said the following: "We fear the great influence wielded by the Jews everywhere. And can you not see that while Muslims and Christians can work together, it is abnormal that either should make common cause with the Jews? They've always been troublemakers." Al-Quwatli surely referred not to the white European Jews with whom he had no experience, but the Mizrahi Jews in Syria itself. The problem was not that the Jews were white. The problem was that they were Jews. Constructed racial categories were meaningless after all, and it was indeed Mizrahi Jews in Syria who were expelled after Israeli independence. So were Jews a race? I would argue that perhaps a better question, at least in understanding anti-Semitism over the past century and a half, and particularly the rise of anti-Semitism in our own day, lay in asking about the racial identities imposed upon Jewish populations, both by the political right and the political left. Both types of constructed racial identities are part and parcel of their age, whether it be in the late 19th century or in the early 21st. But I would say too that both also have their roots very much in decades past. And I'll end with that.
Thank you very much, Professor GODA, and thank you for our panelists for their introduction. We have quite lively, I see comments going on in the Q&A, and we'll start and try to go through as much as we can. I think is the power given to me by this, moderating the session. I think a few people raise a similar question that Professor GODA, you just you started to touch at your end of at the end of your presentation. For example, Daniel A. Angle asked, "How do you define race? Without this definition, it is hard for me to understand your comments." And a similar question was given by Richard Howard. "In all discussions of race, there is no clear definition of what race is. There are many meanings of the word, social, biologic, anthropologic, etc. Could the panel state what they mean by race?" I will throw in my 2 cents and maybe you can pick up. I definitely agree with these comments, and I do understand that there are a number of issues, of course, when talking about race in our postmodern environment, whether it pertains to Jews or to African Americans or to Asians. I mean, I think Professor KUGELMASS touched upon this topic a little bit. There is so little scientific evidence about the prevalence of race as biological. So I think today we tend to look at race more through a social way. But this also fails us, right, at this time, because African Americans are not one big social construct, right? And similarly, Jews are in many ways culturally different. So I believe we need to stop thinking of race as an essence, right, as something concrete, but as a complex amalgam of forces and context, right? We are forced to select one definition of race, social, biological, anthropological, as if there's one version or no version. So I think our approach to race could benefit from some fluidity. It's not either social or scientific. It's a little bit of both, right? We can reconceptualize Jewishness as critical, I hope I can say that word, but critical race theorists, right? They've done the same with other races. So it's not about whether a Jewish race is scientific or social, but it's the idea that it's constructed of many changing realities: social, anthropological, and biological, internal forces and external forces. If we start kind of understanding race in this in a fluid manner, I think we can find a unifying narrative for world Jewry and its much multitudes of Jewish identities, Jewish religions, and nationalities. This could be kind of a uniting space, and this could also help us, explain and come to terms with the past and present hostilities toward Jewishness in its many forms. Jack.
First of all, Professor Hall, you're talking too much with your hands. But the point I want to make a little less facetiously is when I take my definition of anything, I go back to the Torah. And the Torah talks about the children of Israel leaving Egypt as a mixed multitude. So the Torah itself commented on Jewish race and said they weren't a race. So there's my answer.
I guess one of the reasons it's hard to nail down is because some of us have been talking about this term over time, and it has changed over time. So in my eugenic era that I was referring to, it was a way of grouping people. And when they were talking about races, they were talking about Nordics and Alpines and Mediterraneans and Jews. So their idea of race was different from ours, which is why I can't give a definition that's going to hold over time. I think today when people use race, they're sometimes contrasting it with ethnicity, which seems like it has a little more to do with language and shared culture. And when people use race, it seems like they sometimes want to refer to something that might be biologically inherited, but it is constructed, socially constructed. I mean, these are not kind of real categories in a way. I guess what we're trying to do is explain what we think people have meant by race in different times.
They struggled with us, in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And, the feeling in Europe at the time was that race was partly a factor of biology, the blood, and partly a factor of sort of a murky spirit that races had. And of course, every race thought that its murky spirit was heroic, going back to the Nibelungen or Arthurian literature or what have you. But what's fascinating is that the Europeans divided themselves into racial categories and believed that certain biological characteristics were absolutely immutable. I don't think Jews obsessed over this. If you sort of reread the early Zionist literature, it's more based on the idea of sort of a common peoplehood and the common history and those sorts of things, not so much on what were biological characteristics, because to buy into the biological characteristics would be to validate anti-Semitism. And so I think to Jewish writers, these things were a lot more fluid.
The thing is, if you take race out of the equation and change it with ethnicity, and this is a question asked by Jared Tanny, I see, ethnicity is also socially constructed to include kinship and common descent like race. So the difference between the two is not so clear. I think for me, the difference is when you take race out of the equation, or when race becomes an ethnic identity, when saying that Jews aren't a race, it sort of takes away all the suffering and the pain that the Jews have gone through through the ages. This is where the difference for me lies, right? The sort of a dictionary difference.
Yeah, I guess another point about that, the race definition, or what is race, when is it racism? Another side of that question is, when does it matter? Whether we're talking about race or racism. There were a lot of great op-eds that were written in the wake of the Whoopi Goldberg comments. And I remember one that I read by a historian from Alabama, Jonathan Weisen, I think, was pointing out, if you were a Jew terrified because you were held hostage in your Colleyville, Texas synagogue, are you thinking, oh, well, this anti-Semitism isn't technically racism, so I'm okay? I mean, when we are academics, so we sort of argue over this, but is it always actually, how much does it matter in the moment if the persecution is definitely a matter of race or racism or not?
But racism doesn't negate race, or the negation of race doesn't negate racism. They're not the same thing. Right. So people believe in race, even though scientists say it's very questionable whether there is such a thing. And racists certainly do believe in race. Mm-hmm. By the way, I just want to say one thing about this. Years ago, when I had a discussion with some colleagues on this, and there were some scientists in the room, some, real scientists, not like us. And I suggested, well, I guess the difference is that race, the idea of race, there's no real parameters to it. It's not a breeding thing. So it's not like anyone can marry in and breed with other members of the group. So therefore, what does it mean? Versus a species, where within the species, someone from another species can't breed with that species. Okay, so apparently I misspoke. He said that's not true. So, because at the perimeter certainly of the species, there is intermixture. So that even species is not a fixed category and has a certain degree social, cultural, intellectual parameters to it that are beyond issues of, genetics. In all these things, we're dealing with culture. We're dealing with things that people impute that have nothing to do with hard and fast reality.
We look at the board again.
Roy, I see an interesting comment there from Elliot Pilevsky, I think, where Elliot's saying, I found it useful to speak of Jews as a religiously rooted civilization, multicultural, multilinguistic, multiple religious and irreligious expressions with self-identifying Jews of every skin color on every continent. Why isn't this a more common description among Jews or even in the Jewish academic community? I think something like that is pretty common, although I have to admit, often when I'm teaching Intro to Judaism, other classes like that, I sometimes just do a poll in the beginning of the class to ask, and our classes here, and I always have a mix of Jews and non-Jews, how they would describe Jews, at which categories, and I usually offer religion, culture, nation, people, race, and it's kind of spread all over. I think race is a minority of people, but when we start to talk about it, students do start to explain why there's some attraction to the race category, because we all, know Jews who don't feel a religious connection, but in a way, I forget which one of us who talked about a tribal definition, Jack, I think that might have been you. And I think that is a popular understanding, sort of Jews as a family that you can enter, if you convert, you are considered a full member of the family, but that you can never actually really leave your family. And that this isn't about what you profess to believe. And in that way, tribe/race, I think some people feel like there's a connection between, I think, tribe and race sometimes. That explains some of the lingering affinity for it, I guess.
Rachel, what do you think about, I remember a few years ago when President Trump gave his executive order about the Title VI, the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, right? I think part of the backlash, if you remember, that's he extended the act that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin to include the Jews. I think some of the pushback from the Jewish community might relate to this idea of tribalism, right? That Jews are kind of separate. I think nationality was the issue, right? That Jews, because they're a family, because they're a nationality, a tribe, they might not have their heart in the right place, right? Sort of an idea of dual allegiance, right? If Jews are sort of a nation, a tribe, they might not be. They might not see themselves as Americans first, for example. So I know this is right. This is a problem for many.
Yeah, if I remember that executive order, I think it was misunderstood, and it looked like Jews were maybe going to be categorized as a nation, as you were saying. And what was surprising is so many Jews sort of pushed back and said, no, we are a religion. I remember talking about this with a lot of friends in Jewish studies, and we were thinking, really? Because sort of surveys show that younger generations of American Jews don't really identify with it as a religion, but the idea of being grouped as a nationality raised that whole sort of Jews are other specter, that they are not fully American. It sort of had echoes from the past that they would be suspected of dual loyalty or something. So right. The American Jewish attachment to being defined as a religion so that it's very clear how we fit into the American project, that we're patriotic and loyal to this country, which comes as recently as the Cold War. I think that urge to show that. I think that's in some ways somewhat distinctively American, our strong preference for that religion category, as opposed to people or nation.
I would add to that the anxiety among acculturated Jews, not just in the United States, but certainly Germany and France before World War II, their anxiety about Zionism was based on the idea that they didn't necessarily want it out there, that the Jews were a separate nation, because this is what anti-Semites had always argued. This view kind of changes after World War II. But there was this tremendous anxiety beforehand. And getting back to this other business of race, not as it applies so much today, where we can't really get our hands around it with regard to Jews, but we all heard this. Some of us heard it, when we were younger. You don't look Jewish, what's the implication there? You don't look Jewish. That not that there necessarily was a certain Jewish type, but that was the perception, and that this could be identified visually in something. The point that Rachel made, I think, with regard to conversion and that sort of thing, it makes me think of, Jack, you'll appreciate this, and I'm sure Jared out there will. It reminds me of the Seinfeld episode that some of us will remember, where Jerry's dentist converts to Judaism for the jokes. And this offends Jerry because he thinks that you should convert to Judaism for something more than the jokes. And yet the dentist said, Jerry, it's our sense of humor that sustained us as a people for thousands of years, and the whole interplay of how Jewishness is defined with that is something deeper than that, and that one can't simply join, and this being the end of it. I don't want to rely on Seinfeld for an academic discussion, but it does tell us something.
Yeah. I also want to get to Louis Reinstein's comment. He sort of asks us, do we agree that that Jews are not a race? I think most of us agree. Louis, I suppose my own comments are just kind of an explanation of why race has been attractive, when and why it has been used, but that's certainly not how I define Jews, or I doubt anyone on this panel does.
I think what I'd like to add to that is that I don't think anyone on this panel believes that Jews are a race because none of us on the panel believes there really is such a thing as race. I think the larger issue is that all of us probably have experienced ourselves in looking at people, trying to parse who is what. And you look at people and say, he or she doesn't look Jewish. So how is it they claim to be Jewish? There's something fishy about this. And I remember when I was 16, I went out to Western Canada on a high school trip, and it was a German Mennonite colony. And the girl that I sort of was paired up with, her, when she met me, said, you know, my mother, when you got off the bus, she saw you and said, he's a Jew. I was astounded by that. I didn't think that I looked particularly Jewish, but to them, in that community, I did. And that to me is fascinating, that in certain communities, people will look Jewish and people can identify people who look Jewish. I think we are preoccupied with that as well. I think we as Jews always want to know whether someone is Jewish by their looks and why they don't look Jewish. So, and so what I said before, this sort of racial idea clings to us. We all have this idea, even though it's so amorphous, you can't really hang your hat on it.
And I see our colleague Rebecca Jefferson and David Pollinger's comments also sort of bring us back to what Jack was just talking about, the 23andMe and ancestry tests, which are kind of part of this conversation. I feel like that's adding to our kind of tribal moment, where it does feel like, because of what people are able to find out about their ancestry and sort of talking about being 99% Jewish, I think it's something like a racial definition, but I tend to think of it as being a little bit tribal, almost as I imagine when people get those results, they think, oh, I'm really part of this tribe. I don't know what other meanings it might have for folks.
I'm trying to think. It's an interesting question, I think, for me in this forum, particularly because I was born and raised in Israel. So their sort of Jewish identity and your national identity kind of goes hand in hand. I think we define ourselves, most Israelis would define ourselves as Jews. And this is just that's the way it is. Only when I came to America, I mean, this whole ordeal became much more complicated. I'm still fascinated by by the sort of pushback that we have in the panel and in the comments about not treating the Jews as a race. If you look at Wikipedia, the entry for Jews doesn't mention the word race even once. I remember a few years ago being at one of the Association for Jewish Studies panels. I think I was after the Trump declaration of the Title VI. One of the panelists sort of commented on that and said, of course, Jews are not a race. Of course, we're not a race. Sort of remember what happened the last time when Jews were defined as a race, right? Kind of looking back to the anti-Semitism of the Holocaust. But then I also believe that, a part of Jewish identity, the idea that it does not fit with the discourse of other larger or oppressive identity, it's not productive. I think we should not let the Jewish present be dictated by racial stereotypes and persecution, right? The things that defined our past shouldn't define our present. So I think using race to stereotype and discriminate people is very different than using race as a basis for understanding, right, of identity, of solidarity. This is what I'm kind of still wondering about, Jewish identity, and yes, about sort of getting the idea of race in there, not opposing it, whatsoever. Jack.
Well, Roy, I want to go back to what Rebecca Jefferson had asked, and it maybe relates to what you're saying, that some scientists have discussed shared genetic markers as evidence of race. So what does the panel think? Look, what they're really identifying is certain traits that have a certain clustering in certain regions, but it doesn't mean anything. So they may find that certain skin coloration or certain nose types in certain locations. And it's what Franz Boas showed us. There's no connection to language, no connection to intelligence, no connection to anything whatsoever. So it's an incredibly superficial marker that doesn't tell anything other than the fact that it may help contribute to a sense of common identity.
Right.
That if you see people look sort of like you, you may think that, okay, you have some connection. You might want to run the other way. I don't know. But, and we have a lot of evidence. Sorry?
But of course, the idea of race as a self-identifying aspect works for African Americans, for example, right? We could argue the same for African Americans. There's no biological or DNA trait that will put them all together. The same for Asians or Latinos. Right. But we do see, right, the power of racial identity when needing to kind of group together, right? And
exactly to defend the race. You know, they would have that concept, even though you think, why would they need it? They're all of one race. They're not, and they also see differences among them. That there are lighter and darker African Americans, and they're very cognizant of that. It's having some kind of meaning, but it doesn't all cluster together into something with very great meaning aside from the social and cultural context that gives it meaning. And that's what the point is. That's I think what we're arguing here, that race doesn't really have very much meaning except in a social context. It's in context of conflict, in the conflict of social mobility, in the context of attempts from groups to maintain their own culture, to group continuity. So then they invoke race to get a sense of continuity, or as Norm's point about the dentist, you know, that you know, people want to identify with a certain group because they think it elevates them in terms of prestige. So I attended some neighbors of us here and you know, they no one was Jewish other than me, and this woman was talking about the fact of all the great contributions that Jews have made to human existence, and we'll go on and on and on about this and about that, and I was somewhat embarrassed by this, but she was thinking in racial terms about Jews and their achievements. So as I said before, you know, people tend to believe in race, even though we can say there's no such thing. And from the standpoint of Jews may take certain pride in these achievements, believing that it accrues to them because they're members of this group. But is it? Does it? I don't really think so.
Well, the thing that was striking about, and I hate that we're talking about Whoopi Goldberg this month, you know, I mean, I was joking earlier, like when I was watching Sister Act 30 years ago, I never thought we'd be talking about this in 30 years, but the pushback with her that came from Jews almost never said, damn it, we're a race. Where do you get off saying that we're not a race? I don't recall reading that. I recall reading things about culture, maybe ethnicity, common history, and that sort of thing. But there was really no pushback on that particular point. And
Why?
so
Why?
It speaks
Why?
to what everybody did say was that Jews were a race according to Hitler, and therefore, you know, it was all racial or partly racial in that sense. But nobody backed the other idea. So it would tend to speak to your point that most Jews don't define themselves in that particular.
But Norm, it's also because they're speaking publicly. They're too well educated to use the term race. They know that it's been discredited, but do they believe in race? That's another matter. And I think that if you were to get people to confide, they would indicate that they have a belief in race. They have a belief that there's something unique about Jews, whether spirit or whether genetic or something. You know, maybe you're not supposed to say it, you're not supposed to really believe it, but people fundamentally do believe that.
So Rebecca, which we answered her question before, I think makes a point. She said she meant Jewish people as having inherited genetic illnesses like Niemann Pick and Tay-Sachs. I remember when getting pregnant, you go through the series of blood tests, right, of genetic tests that are specific to Jews, right?
Right. So that comment, that clarification from Rebecca sort of points out one of the ways that Jewishness is not just about religion or seems to have something to do with genetics, even though you could also be Jewish and not. Right. So we're sort of getting at the ways Jewishness overflows the boundaries of most of these categories and need, like religion or tribe/race or people, culture. I think we kind of need a collection of categories to talk about what Jews are.
Yeah, I think a couple of the questions, going back to Whoopi Goldberg, but a couple of the audience members wanted to know if we have an idea about how much of a big deal were the comments outside of the Jewish community. I see Stacy Goldring asked that, and how much academia plays a role in the disconnect between discussions like these today. I've seen definitely another questions asking what can we, if we can see it as a learning moment, right, between Jews and Gentiles. Again, my experience teaching undergrads, just this year I taught freshmen who came to college, 18-year-olds, and we talked about the Holocaust, and some of them said that they spend a section of a day, in high school talking about the Holocaust. So it sort of brings us back to the idea that Whoopi Goldberg was uninformed, and then and it's not just the banning of mouths, but it seems to be really a lack of education in the United States, or at least in some states or sections of the country, about the Holocaust and the history of the Jewish people.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of think of the 1990s as a little bit of a golden era, and it was certainly when the U.S. Holocaust Museum opened and Schindler's List came out that same year. It was the 50th anniversary of a lot of World War II events. I think that was a time when we were maybe at a high point in Holocaust education. It does feel like part of what's important in these comments is it kind of highlighted, and then I think there was a fall 2020 survey that I remember reading about that told us sort of the low numbers of young people's awareness or understanding of the Holocaust. So we do seem to be at a time of diminished understanding or of the Holocaust, or even Holocaust education.
Yeah, who knows if it was ever, if it ever did what it was supposed to do. You have to sort of draw the conclusion that it probably didn't. Schindler's List was a Holocaust movie about two Nazis, which was kind of an odd way to approach the Holocaust. But on top of that, the skepticism one has to have is that it's not so much that the Holocaust shouldn't be taught, but that it's European history, where you really don't have much of a frame of reference. Students don't know what communism was anymore, or any of those kinds of anxieties of the early to mid 20th century, at a time when American history is up for grabs, isn't it? We've been arguing for quite some time, not us in this circle, but people in the United States have been arguing for quite some time over how American history should be taught. There's no consensus on this now, and it varies from state to state. So how is Holocaust history, or how's any kind of Holocaust study supposed to move into that when the history of one's own country is up for grabs, and these surveys, no one knows when the Civil War was, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I see one of our students, Keegan Sweet, points out, if race is an abstraction, does that mean it doesn't exist? I have a hard time believing that you could walk into a prison and tell the gangs that it doesn't exist. I think that sort of points out an important point too, that even if there's this academic conversation around race, there's what people actually believe and hold on to, and that what is powerful. Jack was referring to this before. As much as there's been efforts to do away with this racial discourse, it lingers, and it's attractive, and it's still there.
And Rachel, how race functions in social situations, in the context of social conflict. Race becomes extremely important, even though there's no such thing as race. But the fact that people believe in it and has tremendous value in mobilizing people against other people or to defend oneself and one's own group. In those contexts, race is very, very important.
There's one question from, I see Nisan Hershkowitz. How does the following inform the question race or religion? Would you consider that Judaism is unique as a religion for one people, right? Unlike other religions who are expanding, right? Have, he says, designed to encompass many populations and nations. Do we see Judaism as a religion for one people?
I'm going to take a shot at this because I think about this a lot. It is not that Judaism is a religion for one people. It's rather that Judaism is in fact mapped onto a particular people, but it doesn't make it exclusive to one people. And that's there are various aspects of this which I'm not going to go into at this point. But I think that's the misspeak that you made, or that the questioner made.
We were reading some of us were reading Ahad Ha'am a few weeks ago, one of the early Zionist thinkers from Odessa, who was more of a cultural Zionist and who had thrown religion completely over the side, and yet still made the argument that, that the Hebrew Bible told a national story. Believe this or not, but that there were that you could sort of draw a national story out of the Bible, even if you didn't believe in the metaphysics of it.
I'm wondering if the panelists see any questions that they might be interested in answering.
But just to go back to what Norm just answered, but you can also draw a universal story out of the Hebrew Bible as well.
And speaking of this universalizing story, that also what Whoopi's comments sort of did to the Holocaust in making it about man's inhumanity to man. I mean, in a way, we see that even in the 50s with the Diary of Anne Frank becoming, popularized on Broadway and in film, that those versions of the diary made it more, sort of took out a lot of the Jewishness, so that it was that story of man's inhumanity to man. So I could see how Americans growing up in the 50s would have absorbed that idea as well.
Sure, and the George Stevens Diary of Anne Frank with Millie Perkins as Anne Frank, I always kind of called it Gidget Goes to the Holocaust. I mean, it's kind of how it comes out. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
Maybe one thing that we haven't talked about, and it'd be interesting to hear what you think. Bill Maher commented on Whoopi Goldberg. He said, of course, he doesn't agree with her views, but he did sort of mention that her view were put on a show called The View. So we also talked about the fact that Whoopi Goldberg is an African-American, and as much as he doesn't believe with her statements, he thinks that African-Americans have a very specific notion and understanding of race because, of course, everything they have been through. So in terms of that, how much wiggle room is there, when other people try to identify or talk about the Jews? Can we take Whoopi Goldberg stance into consideration? Norm, you shake your head.
Yeah, and I'm very sympathetic to Jack's point about maybe she's trying to find a place for the African American experience, and if the Holocaust is sort of the nuclear bomb of atrocity, then how does one do this? And it's a completely legitimate question. Some of us read a book that came out, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago called Multi-Directional Memory by a literary scholar named Michael Rothberg. And he said something that's very poignant, namely that the memory of atrocity among ethnic groups ought not be a zero-sum game. In other words, Holocaust memory ought not cancel out the memory of slavery, which ought not cancel out the memory of the treatment of Native Americans and so forth, but that rather, what you could have is sort of a negotiated memory where these things kind of learn from and contribute to one another for this sort of multi-directional discourse. It's a very nice idea that these things should not be a zero-sum game. The problem for me is it depends entirely on commentators of goodwill. So for example, W.E.B. Du Bois going to the site of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1947 and saying, wow, there's a lot to learn from one another on this. And as long as you have good people of goodwill sort of doing this and making comparisons that are meaningful, I think multi-directional memory works. I don't think Whoopi Goldberg was ever a person of ill will in this. And, I didn't think she should be suspended, partly because people might think the Jews are behind it. But, I just think this whole business of apologies and that sort of thing has sort of run its course. So I don't think she was a person of bad will necessarily. I agree with you that she was, just fundamentally kind of misinformed. But nevertheless, there is a balance there, and I hate to use phrases like we're living in an age when, but we're living in an age when these things are truly being negotiated, and there are going to be missteps. But I remember when the Holocaust Museum opened in the 1990s, and part of the pushback was, this happened in Europe. This is not even an American memory, aside from the liberation and that sort of thing. That kind of legitimate reaction led to the African American History Museum, which is a tremendous success on the National Mall. And so, these things are getting worked out, and who knows where we're going to be in 25, 30 years.
Thank you. I think that could be a good time to wrap up this panel, right? Unless anything left unsaid or any questions that the panelists are specifically interested in. I know there are many, a few people asked if this event will be available to attendees, if a recording will be available to attendees, and we do have a recording of the event.
It takes about 4 or 5 days for it to get edited. I mean, we don't edit out comments, but the beginning, the end.
So this will be on the Center of Jewish Studies website in a few days, and I'm sure this conversation will be continued in the near future. It is a conversation that has been with us during the last few years, and thank you, everybody. Thank you for our panelists for taking the time to talk to us today. Thank you for the participants who joined up. I hope we did manage to answer some of the questions, or at least open conversation here, and for everybody who's listening at home. Thank you again.
Thank you, Roy.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you, everyone, for coming.